Like that. Everyone's right into attention. If we the earlier we start, the earlier we're done. Good evening, everyone. My name is Anissa Asaibi George. I'm a Boston City Councilor at Large and Chair of the Education Committee. I am joined this evening by Councilor McCarthy and expect some of my other colleagues may make their way in over the course of the evening. This hearing for docket 0169 in order for a hearing regarding the governance structure of the Boston School Committee. I'd like to remind everyone that this is a public hearing being recorded and will be rebroadcast on Comcast 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964, and online. I ask that you please silence your cell phones and any other devices. We will also take public testimony and would appreciate it if you would sign in and indicate that you wish to testify. I will ask that you please state your name and affiliation or residence, and that you limit your comments to 3 minutes or less to ensure that all comments and concerns are heard. I anticipate that this hearing may get a little long, so I will be calling a couple of people between panels to give testimony. I'd like to thank you all for being here today and want to thank all of my panelists for their participation. I know that this can be a contentious topic, but most conversations that are important are. The focus of this hearing is to explore all possible governance structures and to highlight how families can best engage and work together with those who make education policy decisions for their children. The school committee plays a big role in our student achievement and our success of our schools. Their responsibilities range from monitoring the annual operating budget to managing the superintendent and reviewing district policies. It is crucial that we are able to have public conversations about this body. This is an opportunity to have a productive conversation on what is best for our children. I do want to share publicly that while I have not taken a position on this matter, I would strongly like to make the process more transparent and public. I look forward to listening to the various points of view and opinions on this topic. I will now introduce my colleagues in an order of arrival to give any opening comments. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll be short and sweet. You know, you mentioned the word contentious, and I just want to say, you know, if you're in this hearing today, if you've taken the time to come downtown, clearly you care about BPS, and you clearly care about the students and the families that BPS works for, really. I have my own opinion on this. I worked on that campaign in 1994-95, but I'm here to listen and to continue to learn. And I certainly understand that people have different opinions. So as we move ahead, I just want to remind everybody in the hearing and anybody who's watching is that we're all trying to move this process forward. I think we all want what's best for our 57,000 students who participate and the families who participate in BPS.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor O'Malley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your leadership on this and so many school issues. Great to be with you and my dear friend, the District Councillor from Reedville. I will be brief as well in my opening remarks. I know we're going to hear from a number of folks and stakeholders. I think, though, this is very interesting to me. When I chaired the Government Operations Committee back in 2011 or 2012, there was a similar initiative put forth by one of our colleagues that was establish a hybrid model. That means having certain members that were appointed, other members that were elected. It's something that some other cities have done. I actually think there's a lot of merit to that model, and it's something that we ought to be exploring here in Boston. But clearly there are a number of things we can do to make sure that parents feel as though their school committee is truly listening to them and reflecting a lot of the concerns that we've heard. Obviously, we play an important role as the directly elected representatives, be it district or an at-large member of this body, and our oversight on education matters is something that you, particularly, Madam Chair, have taken a great leadership role on, as well as the chair before you, former Councillor Jackson. And that's something that is a role that we really embrace and is important, but it's also, I think, important to think of other ways that we can both engage more people and perhaps look at changes to be made down the road. So looking forward to a great hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor O'Malley. I'd also like to note that we have regrets that have been sent to us by Councillor Janey and Councillor Presley. I'll save those for submission into the record. I also want to note that we've been joined by Councillor Frank Baker. Councillor, we just did opening statements. I'm not sure if you've got one to give.
No, just hi Larry, hi Sam, you know, I look forward to the conversation and see where we go
Thank
with this.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Baker. And prior to the start of our panel, we do have a few members of the public who I'd like to invite up just for some quick testimony. It's been a thing that we've tried this year to get some public testimony in prior to the first panel. So I'd like to invite up, we've been joined by the President and CEO of ABCD, Mr. John Drew, who has some comments that he'd like to share. While Mr. Drew's making his way up, late last year, ABCD did hold a forum on the Boston School Committee and its governance, so I wanted to invite him to share some remarks with us today. Thank you. Welcome, and please share with us your remarks, Mr. Drew. Thank you for being here.
I thank you very much for being invited to the hearing. For background, I'm President and CEO of ABCD. We have 50,000 families that we serve in Boston, low income. I've been doing this for 50 years. I'm a Head Start parent from 1966, 67, 68. I have been dealing with the school department, and why? We're an anti-poverty agency. We're there to try to give people opportunity, and unfortunately for a lot of years, the school department has been uneven, let's put it that way. I come tonight to say that I fully support and have been a year ago, having the public hearing, a form of representation through an elected process of members of the public to a Boston School Committee, which was dismantled 27 years ago, or as Governor Weld said at the time, disenfranchised the people in Boston. There are 450 cities and towns, last count Massachusetts. They all have elected school committees. And I have to wonder, quite frankly, why folks believe that the people in Boston, Bostonians, are not worthy of having their own elected school committee. It baffles me. I believe it makes us all stronger if we have a public school system with all hands on deck. And we have too many of our youngsters have not been able to get through to where their life can be better. I don't want to go through all that. I've watched it over the years, put thousands of kids to work in the summer, have 2 high schools with the public school system. One is a recovery high school for students that are totally lost and back. The other is a high school where youngsters are overaged and almost pushed out of the system, but we recover them back. The school department, to me, the BPS to me, I was born in Charlestown, should be the jewel in the crown, should be where we are taking our youngsters to the next generation, where they will be the next generation, where they will have opportunities. So therefore, if you have an appointed school committee, I think that you get the lesser of. No disrespect for any of our mayors who've had this appointed school committee. But, you know, day in and day out at ABCD, I have 880 staff alone taking care of our children and Head Start. 2,500, 0 to 5. I'm the president and CEO. I cannot hire one of that staff in Head Start without parental approval. And have over here, a new Rona Johnson's our Head Start Policy Council chair, a grandmother. Everything we do in Head Start requires parental involvement. because that is a model that really does work. I believe community involvement also works tremendously and has for decades as we've worked through the city, as we've brought people forward, we've created institutions that weren't there before. We had the first planning grant came from ABCD to the Boston Public Schools in the 60s. So we have a great, great investment in the school department. And I'm only here to say a few words about the fact that maybe, having lived through all this myself, maybe it was messy at times. Maybe it was messy at times. By the way, your city council was messy at times too. We didn't throw you out. I worked for a mayor who was in jail, great guy, in the 50s. Didn't throw the mayor out. So we've had some messy times, we've had some busing times, and we've had other times. But the solution in 1992 to throw out the elected school body, I believe, was totally wrong. I believe the remedy is to go back and really look at it seriously for these youngsters back here, and the youngsters they will have, so that we can have at the councils of the school department, parents, a committee that represents the community, the administration, the superintendent. We do it with the disinfecting of transparency. I believe strongly that we'll be much better off as a community if, in fact, we do just that. However you do it, however this comes out, I'm glad that after a year of talking about it, we're having this council hearing. I had the great honor of having my name in the editorial part of the Herald. They weren't happy with me. But you know what? My job is not to make them happy. It's to try to speak out on issues that affect people's lives. And this, clearly, is an extremely important issue that affects people's lives. And anything we can do to make our system of education in this city better, more transparent, more involved by parents, more knowledge on behalf of the parents and the community about what's going on, we'll be better off. And the only way I can see that happen is to have people select representatives to sit on a school board. You can always talk about how it would work. I know that people are going to talk about how they mismanage money. They didn't mismanage money. They didn't have any money to mismanage. What they did was work on a budget. Yes, going back 30, 40 years, we had a bunch of people who were, for lack of a better word, thieves, stole some money. They also were not great people. They pitted blacks against whites. That's history. That's gone. Now we're in an era where I think we have much more opportunity to really look hard at what's the best way to organize the education system in Boston. And I mean including charter schools. During this hiatus from elected school committee to not, this 27 years, we've built up a large number of charter schools. Wonderful organizations. Private schools, public money. This is all have to come together at some point, in my opinion. But good place to start, and thank you for inviting me. And we have submitted written testimony. Thank you.
John, thank you very much, and thank you for the work that you continue to do over at ABCD with a really great team.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to, thank you. You can head back and hang out with Josh as long as you can stay with us this evening. We also have for testimony, Jen Herlihy, you're next. If you could come to this back microphone with the laptop, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you for having this hearing. And it's really hard to follow someone who talks about the disinfectant of transparency. That was beautiful. I live in Charlestown. I have a 9th grader at Boston Latin Academy. I have a 6th grader at the elementary school in Warren Prescott. And I want to start by saying that I am very impressed with the school committee members and their giving of the time and talent. But at a committee meeting last month, where unfortunately they see me more than they like to every month or so, I indicated to them that perhaps part of the problem here is that they serve at the behest of the mayor, which was a term that my family laughed at because it's a big word, but it's a true word. They're appointed, and thus their job is somehow related to the mayor. And so I don't know, I think there's two problems with that. One, I think that the ability to advocate as a school committee member might be compromised because they know that they are appointed by the mayor. And if such mayor's example, for example, is what parents or residents or taxpayers feel more money should be going to certain projects or schools, perhaps they feel that if the mayor's agenda is different, that they feel perhaps they're not going to be heard by this school committee. The other issue, I think, is when there's a disconnect with central office or the transportation department or someone else, it might appear to a parent who's there to advocate that also if these people are hired by the mayor or under his control, that they may not get the same interest or change that they would if the school committee was not so tied to the mayor. So I stand here before you asking that I think something has to change. And I guess being a BPS ambassador, which I was anointed in '09, I think anyone that showed up at the meeting became one, and an advocate, as a parent who sits and goes to the school committee but doesn't feel they get change when there are very few other parents on the school committee. My suggestion would be that it is done by neighborhood, an appointment each. If you don't like that, then certainly why can't we follow the city council model? Why can't we have, for example, a number one for Boston's neighborhoods of Charlestown, North End, and East Boston? I think it would be better per neighborhood because maybe I don't understand exactly what East Boston's needs are, but I think there has to be some subset of the tax-paying community. Certainly, I think you'll get more interest from parents, but there's also going to be a role, of course, for an educator. I'm not one. I'm just a working mom parent that wants a shuttle bus to BLA from Charlestown. Sorry, that's my plug. It was gratuitous. And I don't understand sometimes when I go there, or I don't feel that I'm getting the same interest level from the school committee members that they might if they were a parent with a kid in Charlestown who has to get on the bus or take the T at 5 in the morning to make a 7:10 bell. And so having a subset of that community there to talk and understand, that's what I think a school committee should be. I didn't know that 450 communities outside of us do it this way. I certainly know it to be normal, and I don't understand why it's any other way. Certainly, I guess the question would be, why is it that the mayor appoints anyone? What is the benefit to the school community, parents, and taxpayers? So I appreciate the dialogue. I certainly think something has to be done. If you don't like my neighborhood suggestion, I'm willing to listen, and I certainly won't be contentious. But I think when the tax-paying parents are the ones that don't see anything getting done, even if that's just a misperception, it certainly would help your constituents. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Next, we have Mike Kincaid and then Brandy Fluker-Oakley.
Good evening. My name is Michael Kincaid, more affectionately known as Willie Kincaid's father. My son Willie is he's a student at Urban Science Academy in West Roxbury, part of the West Roxbury Education Complex, or more affectionately known as the REC. But my testimony here tonight is not about the REC because that's not what we're here to talk about. Councilman, you mentioned that you worked on the '94 campaign, referendum campaign. I'm a graduate of Roxbury High School, class of 1976. Any of us who are old enough to remember the old Boston School Committee loves the irony that Mayor Ray Flynn basically abolished it. And he made his career out of the situation that I was a victim of in the '70s. So I understand why it was necessary to have a selected school committee, because the school committee back in the day basically catered to those people who showed up to vote, period. And if you lived in Roxbury, where I lived and grew up, well, you got what you got. I'm not blaming my mom and my dad and my neighbors for not showing up for voting, but we just didn't back in the day. And that's kind of why we got what we got. But those days are gone. Mayor Ray Flynn is no longer mayor. Thomas Menino is no longer mayor. And folks in Roxbury show up to vote. Folks in Hyde Park show up to vote. Dorchester, Mattapan, and so forth show up to vote. We deserve an opportunity, and I'm a homeowner in the city of Boston. We deserve the opportunity to have our votes counted. We deserve the opportunity that if we're not happy with a particular employee, we can fire them. That's what elections are about. Now, I understand the mayor is responsible for the total outcome of the Boston School Department. But on the other hand, am I the only one that's ever noticed that when things go amazingly well, like at Urban Science Academy, we've got an amazing program for special needs students, like my son, who's autistic. When things go well, the mayor has no problem standing in front of cameras talking about, judge me on the job that I do regarding the school system. But when things go bad, suddenly our superintendents leave to spend more time with their families and take the bullet for what's wrong. Well, personally, and this is a really bad analogy, but if the manager of a McDonald's only wants to make sure that his cashiers get as many people through as possible and doesn't give a damn about how hot the fries are, am I going to keep going to that McDonald's? No. I want to go somewhere where I get customer service. Now, my son has been in the Boston public school systems for 16 years. When Urban Science Academy closes in June and he gets transferred to what we've now been told is Jeremiah Burke, that will be his 10th school in 16 years. Now, the crazy thing about it, his mother and I, we consider ourselves lucky because in 16 years, we've had amazing teachers and we've been in amazing schools. And my son has got amazing service. But part of that is because we show up. That's why I'm here on a Friday night, on a cold Tuesday night, because we show up. So all I'm simply asking of you is to give us what is our due. Give us the opportunity to fail. Give us the opportunity not to show up and vote for our elected school committee, and let those neighborhoods that do show up, if it happens, it happens. We got nobody to blame but ourselves. But at least give us the opportunity. And the idea of a hybrid, come on now, that's not even fair. So thank you for letting me have my testimony. And Councilwoman, you were at last week's school committee meeting. The only reason why I'm here tonight is because you invited me. I didn't even know this was going to happen. I usually go and dance with those guys. So thank you guys for at least putting this on someone's agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kincaid. And then last for this early testimony will be Brandy. Come on down.
Good evening, President Campbell, and abstentia to Madam Chair Asabi George and Honorable City Councilors. Please forgive my illness. I promise whoever comes next, I use hand sanitizer, so hopefully you won't catch my cold and my casualty. I needed layers to make it out on this cold evening. As you know, my name is Brandy Fluker Oakley. It's a pleasure to testify before you twice in an 8-day period. And I'm the Executive Director of Educators for Excellence, a teacher-led nonprofit that works to elevate educator voice in the policymaking process. Thank you for the opportunity to allow me to speak on this important issue this evening. After hearing from our members this fall, it is clear that this issue is less about how the committee is structured and more about accountability and community input into the process. Before sharing their viewpoints, I'd like to remind us all that the reason we moved from elected to appointed is because of racial unrest post-desegregation in busing. As a Bostonian native, as a graduate of Boston Public Schools, as the daughter of a father who went through the busing and desegregation period, I am acutely aware and have heard the stories of what those times were like. At that time, Boston Public Schools was largely black and white, and dramatic measures were taken. The eradication of an elected school committee. However, our city demographics have changed, and we are finally seeing Boston starting to grapple in earnest with some of the racist foundations that have undergirded many of our city's institutions. We must ask ourselves if the status quo decision made post-busing for school committee governance is still necessary today. Since August, we have surveyed more than 500 educators on the topics of current policy in Boston Public Schools. And in the past 2 months alone, 200 educators weighed in on the issue of school governance. What E4E is hearing from our members is that the real governance problem is not how the school committee members are selected, whether appointed, elected, or some hybrid or alternative approach. The real issue is whether or not the school committee is truly accountable to the needs of Boston families, students, and educators. How will a new method of school committee member selection ensure there is authentic community input and feedback on the policies BPS is creating? And dare I even say a method for authentic community input and engagement to actually create and ideate on policies within BPS? The real question of Boston Teachers Collective Minds is all about accountability. Of the members that we surveyed, only 3% of our members identified appointment as their preferred method of selecting members for the Boston School Committee. The remaining 97% surveyed said they were dissatisfied with the status quo and selected either elected or a hybrid method, particularly 55% choosing fully elected and 42% choosing a hybrid. Specifically, Michelle Napor, a teacher at the Holmes Innovation School, shared, the Boston School Committee should be structured to include elected positions as opposed to appointments by the mayor to allow for teacher, family, and community input in the district's decision-making process pertaining to evaluation and management of the superintendent and the establishment of district-level policies. School committee elections can foster community investment in the district by allowing for increased community voice in the selection of the governing body. As you can see, while teachers are split on what the structure should be, there is agreement that change is necessary, and that stems from a need for accountability. The school committee is tasked with holding Boston Public Schools accountable, but who holds them accountable? Some would say the mayor. However, we recognize that Boston is a city heralded for a de facto tradition of electing generational mayors who remain in office for years, decades even. Thus, if the only option is voting in a new mayor, then the community would really have no option at all in ensuring accountability. It's not feasible to tell students, teachers, or the community to vote out the mayor if you want to meaningfully engage as residents in the process of changing policy for our public schools. Every voice has to matter, and there must be multiple avenues for engagement. What is clear is this: even if the structures stay the same, the district needs to continue to find better ways to thought partner and collaborate with teachers, family members, businesses, clergy, BPS alumni, and other citizens and stakeholders throughout all of Boston to ensure students get the best education possible. What cannot continue are closed-door processes and backdoor deals. Our members want leaders, whether elected or appointed, who get at root causes and help to grow solutions by including those who are most impacted in the decision-making process. Thank you for this opportunity to speak and share insights from our conversations with educators. There was also a teacher who couldn't make it this evening, and there are printed copies of her testimony for your review.
Thank you, Brandy. And Brandy, would you share the results of that survey?
Yes.
At some
they're in
point,
the
just submit it.
appendix for
Oh,
all of you.
beautiful. Thank you very much, Brandy. And thank you for your regular testimony, both yours and of the teachers that you work with. Thank you. So we're going to shift gears to our first panel. I do have a few slides, and I think Sam might reference some things that the slides may pertain to that I have, so I'm going to save them for now. But Sam and Councilor DeCara, thank you both for being here. I'll let you introduce yourself. I'm going to let former councilor go first, and we'll get to it. Thank you.
Sure. For the record, Lawrence S. DeCara, 88 Perkins Street, Jamaica Plain, Ward 19, Precinct 3, as Councilor O'Malley knows. I'm in his district. And as one who served on the City Council for 10 years, when this chamber was in its first iteration, I'm honored to speak before you this evening. I've submitted excerpts to Councilor Rasabi George of some academic research I did almost 50 years ago concerning the history of the Boston School Committee. And it shows many things, including that the topic of the committee has been one of intense public discussion, off and on for approximately 150 years. and that the school committee has had many different structures over a period of time. What I will focus on in my testimony is what happened to the school committee after I did that research in 1970 and 71. I also do so as a graduate of the Boston Public Schools, K through 12, and maybe just as importantly, my mother was a Boston school teacher for 34 years, so I learned plenty around the kitchen table. The 70s were not a good decade for the Boston School Committee, and I served on the council for most of that decade. 2 members of the school committee went to jail. Others were indicted but not convicted. The school committee positioned themselves so as to bring about a court order which brought about the desegregation of our schools. They violated the law, plain and simple. Didn't have to be a constitutional scholar. You just had to be able to read. And the enactment of a desegregation plan, which arguably has left the poorest of our children not much better off than they were 50 years ago. That's a debate for another day. I spent much of my time sitting over on that side, because we do it alphabetically, so the B's and the C's and the D's always sit over there, arguing that the council and the school committee, as they then existed, all elected at large, were not representative bodies either with respect to race or gender or geography. For that reason, I championed the mixed at-large district system, which I would argue, even if I weren't here, has done quite well here at the City Council, but which was an abysmal disaster when applied to the school committee. And I admit that I was one of the leaders of the referendum which passed in '81, which brought about that system, the switch from the 5 at large to 9 and 4. Deep in my heart, I believed, as did many others, including some of our business leaders, that a school committee system where the majority of the members were elected by districts, 1/9 of the city each, would encourage parents and others who were legitimately concerned about education rather than obsessed about politics to run for those seats. There were some decent people who served on those committees, many of whom are friends to this day, but there were many who ran only because there was an available office and whose interest in education was de minimis. Most importantly, the interference of the school committee in the day-to-day business of governing a very complex urban school system is a primary variable which brought about the turnover in school superintendents in that decade of the 80s and early 90s. I had the honor of representing Superintendent Bud Spillane when he bought his house, not too far from where you grew up. I think it was in 26, Matt. And then the honor of representing him when he sold it about 3 years later. There's no doubt in my mind that Bud Spillane would have been a long-term superintendent, as was Tom Pezant in the 90s, but for the pestering by members of the school committee with respect to patronage and other matters. He went on to run one of the nation's largest and most successful school systems in Fairfax County, Virginia. Furthermore, each member of the school committee insisted upon having a staff, an office, health insurance. It was a very expensive proposition. One member, who I will not name, even suggested to me that she had a gentleman on her staff whose job it was to taste her food. Therefore, I was one of many people who care about the city and who worked very hard to bring about the appointed committee in the early 90s, and then worked hard to be sure it was supported by the voters on 2 occasions, once when Ray Flynn was mayor and again when Tom Menina was mayor, and I think it was about 70-30, and I think that it prevailed in 16, 17, or 18 of the 22 wards.
20.
It's 20 of the 22? Okay. He got me on a political fact. I hope that's stricken from the record.
The date.
Okay? I'll talk to you later, Tyler. The wonderful thing about the appointed committee is that they do not interfere in the day-to-day operation of the school system. They do not view their job as being one of providing employment, of which we currently have 9,500 employees, more or less, for a school system of approximately 57,000 students. I believe, as do many others, that for us to return to placing names on the ballot for election to the school committee would result in extraordinary divisiveness and would make it less likely that superintendents in the Payzant mold would stay in Boston. Thank you. Happy to respond to whatever.
Thank you very much. I think we'll take testimony from Sam, and then we'll open it up to
For the
questions.
record, Sam has about as much mileage on his tires as I do, except he goes to more school committee meetings. He speaks from expertise.
You can now watch them online and stream them live.
Yeah. Well, I got spoiled in terms of our office being a block away from 26 Court Street, so it's a whole nother matter now. So, Madam Chair and members, for the record, my name is Sam Tyler. I'm the president of the Boston Municipal Research Bureau. And I guess influenced by John Drew, I'm going to tell you that I have been observing and writing about the Boston School Committee since 1972. So I've seen firsthand, the Boston Public Schools with the worst and some better 5-member school committees. And from 1982 to 1991, the dysfunction of the 13-member elected school committee. And since 1992, the 7-member appointed committee. And I think from these years of experience, I can unequivocally state that the appointed school committee structure affords Boston the best chance to improve school performance in all areas: academic, operational, fiscal, and managerial. Now, I think we all agree that no board structure by itself is going to be a solution to the challenges facing the Boston Public Schools. However, governance structure can facilitate the support for effective implementation of policies to improve teaching, student achievement, and operations. I also want to say at the beginning that while school governance has been an issue that comes and goes, there are more important issues that we should be devoting our attention to and our energy to that would have far more benefit to the parents and students of the Boston Public Schools than school governance. Turnaround of underperforming schools, student achievement gap, particularly by race, build BPS, professional development and evaluation to improve effective teaching. I mean, these are just a few of the issues that really ought to be addressed. So going back to the appointed structure, we have supported, we were involved with the creation of the appointing board. And the main reason because it holds the mayor fully accountable for public education. And also that the school committee can be more diverse with members who have a mix of experiences and skills to be a cohesive educational body. And for the past 25 years or 26 years, the appointed committee has proven to be more educationally focused, fiscally responsible, and better able to tackle important but political difficult issues than the record demonstrated by either the 5-member elected committee or the 13-member elected committee. With the elected committee, school committee members were more concerned with day-to-day operations than they were with broad educational policy, and their issues of concern were more, frankly, constituent issues not related to educational policy. And the constituents were not the students, but the adults. Boston's move to the appointed school committee structure actually evolved over a decade of attempts to make the elected process work. In fact, the change came only after a series of efforts to improve governance of schools within the existing elected structure. In 4 separate occasions, from 1978 to 1987, legislation was enacted which focused on strengthening the role of the superintendent and limiting the school committee's role to more of a policy body, which was, I guess, eventually felt that wasn't enough. The primary benefit of the appointed committee is that it holds one person accountable for Boston school performance, the mayor. The fundamental flaw of the elected committee was that it did not ensure direct accountability in any one person or board. The mayor was required to raise the funds to support the system, but the school committee decided how the money would be spent. The division of duties contributed to a culture of mistrust and finger-pointing rather than improved collaboration that exists today. This direct accountability must be maintained, and it would be weakened I believe, through an elected or hybrid structure. The appointed committee has proven to be far more successful in creating real stability in the superintendent's position and continuity of educational programs, in stark contrast to the continual turnover of 10 superintendents in a 24-year period under the elected committee. As has already been mentioned, Tom Bezant served 11 years, Superintendent Carol Johnson served 6 years, and that stability, particularly with Tom Bezant's time, made a big difference, which academic studies have shown in terms of student performance. In addition to being a cohesive additional policy body, the school committee has the duty to exercise its fiduciary responsibilities, since the school department is the largest city department and its employees represent 1/2 of the city's total workforce of 18,000 employees. The elected structure included no incentive for the school committee to control spending or any penalty if it did not. Every year since 1992, under the appointed school committee, the school department has ended a fiscal year with an operating surplus. As an elected body, the school committee incurred operating deficits in 11 out of 14 years prior to 1992. There's also financial benefits for having the mayor's direct accountability for the public schools. The fact that over the last 10 years, during difficult fiscal times and escalating state assessments, health insurance costs, pension costs, the school department's share of the total departmental budget in the city remained steady at 35%. All other departments, other than police and fire, in aggregate, represented a smaller share of the total departmental budget over 10 years. During this time, state school charter tuition assessment increased by $118 million, or 213%, and the BPS was held harmless as the city of Boston absorbed those expenses, not the school department. That's not the case in other school districts in this state that have charter schools. And as you know, the charter school tuition assessment represents the Chapter 70 education aid that follows the student that live in Boston but go to charter schools. Also, in the current fiscal 5-year capital bond plan, total bond funding for schools represents 28% of the total. Coming second is public works, which represent 18%. So not only in the operating budget, but in the capital budget, the fact that the mayor has direct responsibility for school performance does make a difference in the financial benefit of the school department. Also, by making the mayor fully accountable for educational performance, a larger number of voters are better positioned to influence school improvement than a smaller number of voters who would divide their mandate among elected committee members. More voters in Boston go to the polls to vote for mayor than any other elected position. So far more voters hold the BPS accountable by voting for the mayor than those who would vote for the school committee races. And then prior to 1992, school committee races lacked competition as well as votes. In 1989, the last elected school committee race, incumbents in 4 out of 9 districts, school committee races ran unopposed. No district committee candidate in a competitive race received more than 16% of the vote. That's not really parent representation. Parents have a role not only as voters, but also they can serve on the school site councils and have more say in terms of the operation of their children's schools, as well as selecting the teachers to work in those schools. So that's how really parents can be involved in terms of what's important to them. As you know, the legislation in creating the appointed board required 5 years afterwards, in 1996, for a binding question to ask whether voters wanted to stay with the current 13-member structure or go back, stay with the appointed board or go back to the 13-member elected structure. And as Larry mentioned, it was a 70-30 margin to retain the current 7-member appointed structure rather than the return. that vote, the yes was won by a plurality of about 59,000 votes. The stability and steady progress in Boston under the appointed board has given national and local foundations and businesses confidence in financially supporting a variety of education initiatives. And in 2006, the Boston Public Schools Department was awarded the Broad Prize for being the nation's most improved urban school system. And the school department was a finalist for this award for the 3 previous years. The hybrid structure has been introduced, as was noted recently by Councilor Baker. It was also part of a commission recommendation in, I guess in 1989, which was, there were two commission studies back then. One was chaired by Hubie Jones. That commission made a recommendation of moving from the elected to appointed structure. A second one was suggested by the city council, appointed by the mayor. That commission came back and suggested partly all appointed or a hybrid system of partly elected, partly appointed. In 1989, the hybrid structure was quickly dismissed as being divisive and incompatible with the need for real accountability and a clear line of authority. In 1990, the Research Bureau issued a report on the hybrid structure and opposed it, feeling that it would inhibit the communities available to function, or the committees available to function as a policy body. So no board structure by itself is the solution to the challenges facing the Boston Public Schools. However, existing appointed board structure is the best chance to ensure that the mayor remains fully accountable for public education, that school committee members have the mix of experiences and skills to be a cohesive educational body, and that the school committee responsibly exercises its fiduciary responsibility. I think both Larry and I have seen the situation where the mayor raises the money but doesn't have any kind of a role in the operation, even from a distance. And I think there's been a marked difference in terms of the collaboration between City Hall and now 2300 Washington Street than there has been ever with the elected committee. I just want to raise one last issue, or maybe two, just in terms of the nominating process, that the mayor doesn't have carte blanche here. The nominating process created with the establishment of the appointed board was intended to create a level of independence. So there are 13 members on the panel. The mayor only appoints 4. The panel makes recommendations for each open position of no less than 3 nominees, no more than 5, and the mayor must appoint one of those individuals. So it is an independent process, and it's a process that's an open process. The meetings of the panel are public, even the interviews are public. It's only when there's discussion in terms of which of the nominees to select that they go into executive session. And I also would note that, yes, Boston is the only city in the state that has an appointed board, but for good reason. But that started a process that now throughout the country, so major cities, there are over 20 cities where there's an appointed board by the mayor. And I think it's because the mayors realize that public education is critical to the vitality of the city, and they need to play a role and ensure that it's protected, that it's well supported, and it serves the interest of the students and the parents. And that's the point of the appointed board here.
Right. Thank you, Sam. And I just, on the overhead, for those of you that are here in the chamber, I've just pulled up the current citizens nominating panel, the membership, and the list of members of that board. So at this time, I'd like to open up for questions from my colleagues. I'll start with Councilor McCarthy.
No, I really, I don't. I listened to both testimony, and I certainly appreciate, you know, your long-term service to the city of Boston, both of you. So I'm more eager to listen to testimony than, you know.
Thank you, Councilor McCarthy. Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ditto appreciate Larry, Sam, both of your long and loyal service to our great city. I just wanted to push back on something you said in your remarks, Sam. You said there are more important issues that we should be focused on, we being the City Council. No,
I actually meant city.
Fair point, okay. Whatever. I think that sort of does a disservice to what we're trying to do here, because we are, A, capable of focusing on more than one issue at a time. As it relates to Build BPS or equity or, you know, student assignment, these are issues that we're working on in tandem with that.
And I think you also included the achievement gap.
The achievement gap. I mean, we're working on all of these issues, and I think the fact that despite that, many people in this room, many parents, many teachers, many activists are at this meeting tonight. We're at another meeting 2 nights ago, at another meeting, we'll be at another meeting 2 nights from now, shows a real desire for involvement in having teacher voices, having parent voices, having student voices, most importantly, in my estimation. So I always think that's an intellectually lazy argument to make that, well, we shouldn't do this because there are other things we should be focusing on. There's plenty of bandwidth and brain power and desire in this room and outside this building to tackle a whole host of issues. Similarly, you know, I think, Larry, you made some compelling points, and this is something that I've often sort of grappled with as it relates to the school committee. I think I began my process thinking we should have an all-elected, let's go back to the all-elected school board because of some of the historical context that you provided and others in my own research. I actually think that the hybrid model is something that we ought to really embrace, because it both would allow for some folks who would be appointed and sort of have that freedom of not having to stand for election, while at the same time allowing an individual to be more accountable to the voters and the parents and the stakeholders of BPS. So, you know, I know there are plenty of good people who can disagree on how we get there, but I do think that there's enormous benefit to having this hearing and continuing this conversation, exploring what some other options are. So I guess my question is, if we now are 20 plus years or so, I guess closer to 30 years of having this current model, why haven't, in either of your opinions, why haven't any other cities or towns in Massachusetts followed suit, particularly the Worcester, Springfield, sort of larger cities? Why haven't others followed suit?
I expect because their systems are not 10% as complex as ours. That's just a guess. Be honest with you, I ran statewide 40 years ago. I don't spend a lot of time outside of Boston, so I'm not as attuned as I may have been back then. You know, the Commonwealth has a history going back to the founding of Boston Latin School in 1635 of having school committees. They've had all sorts of shapes and sizes, and they've had varying intents. If one goes back far enough, it basically was the intent of the Protestant majority to Americanize Catholics by insisting upon the reading of the King James Version of the Bible and things like that. That's really the legacy of Horace Mann. And in the research that I did for Councilor Asabi George, there's a very interesting decade or so when women could vote for school committee but could not vote for anything else. I think it was the 1880s.
Wow.
I don't have total recall, and neither of us was there, although it's close. Then the Catholic Church decided that a woman's place was in the kitchen and not voting, so a whole bunch of Protestants got elected to the school committee. And then, almost by divine intervention, somebody decided that maybe women could vote, and there was Catholic women started to vote, and then you had a balance of people on the school committee in the 1890s, whenever it was. So these issues have been back and forth for a long, long time. And why other cities in the Commonwealth have not, I don't know. I do know this, that Chicago has had an appointed school board for a long, long time. My old friend Sergeant Shriver chaired that board for Mayor Daley the father, the first of many Mayor Daleys in Chicago. in the 1950s, and that New York has had an appointed board as far back as one can remember, and Robert Wagner, as I recall, was a guest at my house once for a cocktail party. He was chairman of that school board like a generation after his father was mayor. So the big cities have had appointed boards, many of them for a long, long time.
Okay. And then...
Well, let me,
yep.
if I may answer that
Sure.
question as well. I mean, I think it was because of how dysfunctional the 13-member committee was. It was untenable. It couldn't continue. And I repeat that there were 4 different attempts, well, not attempts, there were 4 pieces of legislation passed trying to make the elected structure work. It's to the point where the superintendent in Boston is probably the most powerful superintendent in the country. As these efforts were trying to define the superintendent's authority vis-a-vis the school committee and make sure the school committee was out of the day-to-day action and just focusing on educational policy. But even with that, it wasn't enough, which is what led Mayor Flynn to create the committee chaired by Hubie Jones to take a hard look at that.
I completely get that, Sam, but my question is why haven't, if the Boston model would proffer better educational outcomes, why haven't the 350 other cities and towns in the Commonwealth adopted this? Larry's point is, well, we are more, I will happily concede the fact we are a lot more complicated, larger by far than any other district, yet there are certainly some large districts there. There are certainly some challenges there, particularly I'm thinking some of the gateway cities, and yet the trade-off seems to be in many of these cities or towns that having that sort of direct representative outweighs the fact that there still may be some issues and it's not perfect. So I guess this is really more of sort of an information gathering process. If what indeed is been on the books in Boston for the last 30 years makes so much more sense, why isn't it done elsewhere? And I would argue that maybe we ought to be looking at doing things a little bit differently.
No, I mean, it is done elsewhere. There, as I said, there are over 20 large urban
I'm speaking
centers.
specifically about Massachusetts.
Okay, but it makes sense. It makes more sense for a large, much more complex district to be able.
Fair
to
point,
have
and
a
I'd be
policy
interested
body.
then to see the sort of the mid 600 to 700, even to 800,000 population cities and what they have, because New York has 12 million, Chicago has 3.5, 4 million, maybe more than that. I don't know what the LA model is, but we're talking about sort of the mega cities in the country compared to Boston. So that's all for now. Other than I would just say, you know, well, I will leave it at that and let my colleagues go. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'd also like to recognize that we've been joined by Councilor Lydia Edwards. I just have a quick question. Well, hopefully it's a quick question with a shorter answer. But are there ways, in your opinion, to improve the current appointed body without making it elected?
Yes. I mean, if you were to take a look at the appointed board in the early years, I mean, that was a blue ribbon committee. Top people, both in terms of, you know, parents, but also business, education. And, you know, we just, the nominating panel just went through a process where Regina Robinson and Jerry Robinson's terms were going to expire at the end of this year. And so there was an effort to try to encourage people to apply. I mean, they're both incumbents, so that probably stopped some people from applying. But other than their own applications, for 2 open seats, there were only 7 other nominations. We got to do a better job of trying to encourage really committed people who want to make a difference in education and help the students to apply for these jobs. And then it's going to be incumbent upon the mayor to make sure that he picks the best person for that job. And it's a person who he should understand that he is better served by having a strong, committed member of the school committee who may push back because of their own experience. But that's going to be good. That'll be better for the system. So we could do a better job of trying to encourage people to apply for the school committee position. We can do a better job hoping that the mayor will pick the best person.
Thank you. Larry? Councilor Baker?
Did you want to say anything to that, Larry?
No, nothing to add on that.
Are there any cities that have changed recently, like become appointed in the last 15 or 20 years that may be comparable to Boston? Anything that we know of?
No, I mean, soon after, well, Boston was one of the first.
Yeah.
Boston and Chicago. And after that, more cities have joined in.
New York after Boston?
Yeah, but soon after Boston, Providence, Rhode Island also moved to an appointed board. Philadelphia actually had an appointed board before Boston, and that was originally the model, but the nominating process was changed because the Philadelphia model would allow the mayor to reject until he got somebody that he wanted, and that's why the nominating process is structured the way it is here to provide independence between the panel and the mayor.
The mayor has final say, though.
Yeah, but
so
it's
they
only
bring recommendations to the mayor.
But he has to pick from the list of nominees that are presented by the nominating panel. He can't reject them and say, I want more names.
Yeah. So Anise had asked, so I thought was a good question. How if maybe going to an elected or a hybrid isn't the right model? What else can we do within this structure here? Can we add seats to it? Could we add a teacher? Could we add a student? Could we add a parent? So it would go up 3 seats. Could we do things like that?
Well, I mean, the members of the Boston School Committee have to be Boston residents. Mm-hmm. So anybody who's a resident can submit an application to be considered for the position. You know, a teacher, being on the committee, making policy decision affecting his or her own position is not necessarily advisable, but
Yeah, that could be a 268A problem. I represent a different municipality, and we actually had a discussion about that today, where in this case the person would have to recuse themselves each time there would be something that would be germane. So that would be a real problem, because arguably most every vote they take, certainly budgetary matters, would impact somebody who's a teacher. You could have a retired teacher. That probably would not be a conflict.
So Larry,
268A can be brutal that way.
did you do the legislation that originally went to the 13-member?
Yeah, I worked on that.
And that was the same as this here? It was 4 at large and 9?
Right.
9 district?
I worked on that in the late 70s, early 80s.
From the city council or as a?
No, we tried it from the city council. We did not succeed. There was a state law that was crafted by Bill Galvin, sometimes called the Galvin Bill, which allowed any Plan A city of over 100,000 people, of which there were 2, Boston and Springfield, could, by referendum, change the council and the school committee so that there would be one person for each certain number of members of the population and 4 at large. I forget the exact language. And that failed in 77, and it passed in 81. And that's how we had that system beginning with the election of 83, which is one of the reasons
Which is when we went to that same system?
Correct. That's one of the reasons that was the highest turnout we've had in the city election. It's almost, we had over 200,000 people vote that November in the city election, because you had all these new seats being created.
In your opinion, why do you think it was so bad, like the 13-member?
I think that the people who were elected were more interested in politics than they were in education, with a few exceptions.
Yeah.
And with all due respect, people who are funeral directors and folks like that, these are not folks who are necessarily interested in education. They're interested in politics. And the committee as a body was brutal. And Sam attended far more meetings than I did. The meetings were dysfunctional. And that's one of the reasons you had this succession of superintendents, which is not good for anybody. And when we had more stability, as we did with the appointing committee, we had Tom Pazant and we had Carol Johnson combined, like 17 years for the two of them.
Council, the 13-member committee for an educational policy body was totally unwieldy. It didn't work, and they didn't have the right people, frankly. That's one of the reasons that the Research Bureau opposed the 13-member structure for the school committee. It made a lot of sense for the city council because prior to that, there were whole areas of the city were not represented. So the district structure ensured that every neighborhood would be represented, and then with 4 at-large members. But that's unfortunately it was hitched together. So
hitched together by the state legislation.
Yeah, but it's important and it works well for the city council. But for an educational policy body, it was totally dysfunctional.
And then we went to appointed in 83?
91, 92.
91?
92, it was the first year.
Yeah, because Ray got elected in 83, right. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Counselor, and thank you, the two of you, for being here. Did you? Oh, you do have one. Okay. Go ahead, and then Counselor.
So when it went to appointed, was there language in there for confirmation ability? For city council, like
No.
There was never any language in there.
No, it was intentional to ensure that the full accountability would be on the mayor.
Okay. Thank you, Madam
You're
Chair.
welcome. Counselor Edwards.
I'm glad you brought up accountability, and I apologize for missing so much of the hearing, and I've been listening to it online between meetings. But I did want to get back to accountability to the public. I think one of the biggest issues has been that people feel that they can be seen, can speak at length, and that there could be no repercussions for being totally ignored by the school committee. And in many cases, an election or a process in which you must come before the public and present yourself, your qualifications, why you are there in your position, is a part of accountability. And how can we assure that there's true accountability for the members of the school committee, not the mayor?
Well, I mean, in the end, the mayor is held accountable.
I know, but the members of the school committee.
That's where the pressure needs to be, so that it filters down to the school committee members.
Well, so there is no way in the current structure, is what I'm hearing, to hold the members accountable.
Well, I mean, other than
directly.
You know, I guess attending school committee meetings and in public comment, making the point, but legally, no.
Okay. Larry, any?
Correct. I mean, the idea, and we were both involved with the efforts in the late 80s and early 90s, was in fact to have the mayor own the schools, because everybody knows who the mayor is, and the mayor's going to be on the ballot. And the reality is that after a few years, a lot of the members of the school committee were unopposed, which meant they weren't very accountable either. I mean, in this body, when I was here, there were like any place from 23 to 41 of us ran every 2 years. Mm-hmm. But that system, you did not have the good faith effort from the parent from East Boston to run for the school committee. That just didn't seem to happen for reasons that, as I said in my testimony, mm-hmm. I believe deep in my heart that in addition to making the school committee more representative geographically and race, gender, everything else, that in fact you would have people who this is what they cared about as opposed to running for the council or for clerk of courts or for sheriff or whatever the case might be, which is what people in the school committee had done for decades. And that did not change with the 13-member committee.
But I guess the backwards would be then a person not taking bold moves or being able to be out front or progressive to protect their position as an appointee on the school committee is also a risk that we're taking by assuring that the mayor is the only one that can appoint them, right? So you point out the fact that people will use that as a political stepping stone to get onto something else. And as a result, they really won't care about education. They really won't care about how our schools are impacted or the equity. I would argue that we have the same issue then. They don't have to care either way if they're appointed, and they do the bidding of the mayor and do exactly what he says, regardless of the results, regardless of the anger, regardless of the angst of parents as well. So there's a balancing act in both ways, I suppose. That's all.
As I said, and again, forgive me if you may or may not have been listening, this has been a discussion going on for about 150 years. We've only been around for about half of it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Thank you again to the two of you for being here for the history lesson both this evening and leading up to tonight. Thank you. So at this point, just before the second panel comes down, I'd like to give an opportunity to 3 more folks for public testimony. Damon Magnuski, Tashawn Tinsley, and Monty Neal. No, I just have one right now.
Thank you for having me today. My name is Dan Magnuski, and I have a daughter at the Warren Prescott. I personally don't want to vote for a school committee, as it just adds people to an already crowded ballot, and I feel I do not have the time to properly research the people I have to vote for today. I prefer to have the mayor responsible as a single point of contact for complaints or praise, and as one name I have to remember at election time. However the school committee is formed, I want them to focus on education of children in the most continuous way possible. Every transition to a new school is disruptive for both the student and the parent. For the student, it resets long relationships and likely increases bullying. For the parents, every lottery round is extremely stressful. Every school has a different cost-benefit analysis because they have different starting and ending times, commutes, and number of grades. Some families, such as ours, have 2 earners, and we cannot accommodate the hours of certain schools. If our children have to go to different schools, or if our commutes must change, or the hours of the schools change, we have to move out of Boston. Personally, with changes coming to the Warren Prescott, we feel we got a raw deal out of the lottery. We felt originally that we won, as our children would have a seamless K1 through 8 experience with programs available from 8:15 in the morning to 6. With the potential changes, we may be forced out of Boston. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. And Mr. Tinsley.
Good afternoon.
Dale, come on.
My name is Tashawn Tinsley. I am an educator at the Taylor Elementary School in a substantially separate classroom. For those who do not know what that means, it means I teach in a special needs classroom for the BPS. For me, my students are more than just my students. They're my family away from my own. Each comes from a different background, and each has a different story to tell. I'm here to speak for them and children just like them. Transportation issues, school start times, and lack of educational vision have hindered their development not only at the school level, but at the executive level. On many days, my students who are supposed to have door-to-door service have suffered from a lack of oversight of the BPS Transportation Department and have missed their allotted time for breakfast. I cut into their instructional time purposely in order to ensure that they start their day with a good meal. I have visited other schools, and they have told me that this experience is a mirroring experience for them. Not just for our special needs students are suffering. 4,000 homeless students across the city of Boston have seemingly been overlooked. We haven't even began to address the social and emotional traumas many students are dealing with at such a young age. If it would please the council, I'd like to share a story. I meet new students every day who have seen me around the building giving high fives, sharing encouragement, and sharing small laughs before going back to our classrooms. One morning, as I stood in the school caf, a friend walked over to me. He had introduced himself, and we spoke, and I commented on his sweater. He mentioned how it was given to him by his dad. He mentioned how he had missed his father, who was, quote, up there, because he had succumbed to the violence in his neighborhood. I didn't ask for this information. My new friend felt compelled to share what was going on in his life. He and I shared a moment, as I too have lost my father at a very young age. He continued on and mentioned his mother being too broke for Christmas. It was disheartening to hear at such a young age the emotional trauma he had already endured. What upset me more is that the only thing I could do was to advise him to rise above his situation. There are children like this across the city of Boston. My friend and the other 57,000 children deserve representation that understands them, understands the challenges our educators face, to teach, but not just to teach, but to inspire. The old way of an appointed school committee does not work for every student and or their families. Their voices and their stories are not often heard, and I urge the council to empower accountable, representative leadership for our schools, not just because of our students, but because families deserve more than just business as usual. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for being a teacher. Monty.
Thank you. My name is Monty Neal. I'm a member of the Boston Educational Justice Alliance and the Board of Citizens for Public Schools, and I live in Jamaica Plain. Thank you for holding this hearing on what is clearly a very important matter. Boston needs to return to a democratically elected school committee. This is a discussion fraught with the weight of generations of struggles over race and class, and with the complex difficulties facing Boston as all other urban school systems. I wrote my doctoral dissertation titled "The Struggles of Boston's Black Community for Quality and Equality in Boston's Public Schools, 1956 to 1987. Gene McGuire was one of my key reference. In it, I explored the terrible history of deep racism in the schools, how the Black community struggled to end segregated schooling and transform teaching and learning, and why these struggles had only limited success. The short answer was the continued victory of racism, at times in a softer form, over the needs of public education. Those were the key problems of the elected school committee, which were also frequently rife with incompetence, educational ignorance, opportunism, and even thievery, as we heard from the previous panel. That history would seem to militate against a return to an elected committee. However, over the years, we have seen the appointed committee make decisions that are educationally unsound, fail to advance equity, but perpetuate inequality, and are not in the interests of students, parents, teachers, or the community. Both Mayors Menino and Walsh, and therefore the committee, which never opposes the mayor, have seemed far more willing to listen to corporate interests over those whose voices should be most heard. Indeed, Boston does fit with a national pattern, but is one in which corporate interests, backed by think tanks and foundations, oppose democratic participation in governing urban school systems and favor appointed boards they are better able to control and manipulate it. I've studied education across the country in my work as former director of Fair Test, and I can tell you that that kind of terrible appointed committee has certainly been true in New York City and Chicago. Because of changed demographics in the quarter century since the start of the appointed committee, including the huge growth in Latinx and other immigrant groups, the student and parent and electoral landscape of this city has changed. I believe that frequently this city council, in both its composition and its voting, comes closer to representing this new Boston. And I believe that an elected school committee will now do the same. In addition, the Boston School Committee needs a voting student representation. It will be far more responsive to the needs of the people whom the school system is intended to serve. It will not be a panacea, but it will provide the space and opportunity for active community engagement and for educational progress that the appointed committee has not done and shows no signs it will do. It is time for a change. It is time to strengthen and expand democracy, and it is time for the city of Boston to have an elected school committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Monty. So now I'd like to call down our second panel. We have Tanisha Sullivan from the NAACP. I saw her come in. Oh, there you are. Is Jose Lopez here as well? Great, there you are. Ruby Reyes from Boston Education Justice Alliance, Edith Bazil from BEAM, and Mary Battenfeld from Quest. So if you could, doesn't matter where you sit. Oh, thank you. Sure, we'll take that. Thank you all for being here. Oh yeah, just roll on down. Those microphones will scoot a little bit. Thank you. Tanisha, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. Introduce yourself for the record and give any testimony that you'd like to share.
Good evening. Thank you, Councilor Sabi George, for this opportunity to speak with the Education Committee of the City Council this evening. I will not be giving the opening testimony on behalf of the branch. That will be done by Jose Lopez, but I am Tanisha Sullivan, resident of Hyde Park and current president of the NAACP Boston branch.
Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jose Lopez. I'm a resident of Roxbury and homeowner there, and the chair of the Education Committee of the Boston branch of the NAACP. Thank you, Madam Chair, for having us tonight. Thank you, City Councilors, for hearing us. And thank you to everyone who's here in attendance. I see a lot of education, civil rights folk here. I just want to thank all of you for the work that you've done up until this moment. I know it's long work, but know that we're going to continue this fight. And thank you, Lydia Edwards, Councilor Edwards, for raising such poignant points. I appreciate your analysis and questions always. I'm sorry Larry's not here. I do think I want to clarify the record historically on a couple of things. I think it's important to note that the first referendum that actually changed the school committee only passed by a 51% margin. And there were 20,000 ballots cast that were left blank on the question. There was an uprise at the next election where it was split 69 to 31, but that was after the legislature had already legislated on that question. And so I think it's important that when we're dealing with those numbers, we look at what they were and some of the context around those. The first time the city was dealing with the issue, it wasn't so clear cut. 51% margin isn't much, especially when you have 20% of the folk undecided on the issue. In addition to that, I do want to speak on the question of accountability completely resting on the mayor. I think we also have to be mindful that 26% of our children in Boston do not attend Boston public schools. And so for all of those families who are voting, the governance of Boston public schools is not their main issue, I would argue, when deciding on a next mayor. And so we have to be careful to assume that everyone's approaching the election of a mayor with education at the top of their list, specifically for at least those 26% of children who don't attend BPS schools. We were asked to participate in this dialogue around the school committee governance to share the input conveyed to us by our members, their expertise, our mission, and also by history. Let's talk about some of the things that have occurred during an elected school committee. We've seen during that time, between 1974 and 1980, over 1,000 black and minority teachers and administrators added to our system. We saw the first time in our history, even up to this point, the first time we had 2 African-American superintendents run our schools back to back. The guiding question here is whether another governing structure could lead to more accountability for the actions of our school committee members, and whether we should have that mechanism in place here in Boston. I think it's also worthy to note that one of our speakers tonight lives in the city of Holbrook with an elected school committee. The participation of our parents and community stakeholders in the decision-making process really is limited to two official avenues. The first being participation in school committee meetings, the second by a vote for the mayor who appoints these members. In trying to understand and contextualize how much power and choice really exists there, I'm going to offer you 3 vignettes. There are 3 instances where I wonder if school committee members might have conducted themselves differently if they were held accountable by local elections. The first, on October 23, 2015, the school committee signed an agreement to offer severance packages to teachers who were occupying suitable professional capacity positions. Of those over 200 teachers, most were characterized as teachers of color, black, and of having been evaluated as proficient or exemplary. At the same time, BPS was in noncompliance with the federal court order requiring that 25% of the teaching faculty be black. That time we were at less than 21%. Notwithstanding the need to diversify, necessitating the hiring of more teachers of color, the school committee required that in a severance package offered to these teachers, in exchange for their right to a position, that they never apply for a position within BPS in their lives, except as a substitute. These were well-seasoned educators with years of experience who had been evaluated at a minimum as proficient, and we required that they leave the system never able to apply. This document was signed by our school committee. Second, we remember that on December 15, 2010, a school committee member incited by racial animus yelled at a parent, disparaged them based on race at an open meeting, and perceived economic status of this parent. The third example was the surprising and avoidable error in how the school assignment system was implemented for 6th grade. Families were supposed to have access to the closest 2 Tier 1 schools for children in 6th grade, but the algorithm was set to determine school quality based on the closest Tier 1 kindergarten schools. As a result, schools that didn't offer 6th grade were removed from the list of schools that parents could choose. Consequently, this meant that no Tier 1 schools remained for these families who were ultimately overrepresented by black and brown children. That algorithm was required to be audited every year and had not been audited for 4, causing arguably irreparable harm to these families. That was a school committee responsibility. These 3 examples provide instances where conduct by school committee members were the proximate cause of poor representation of the values of our school system and policies that not only potentially caused irreversible harm to our children, but made it more difficult for the school department to meet its obligation to diversify as ordered and achieve its mission. This consequently leaves many to wonder if an elected body would yield different results. Different decisions made on these policies. Could residents more easily remove a school committee member motivated by racial and economic bias? Could parents find more dignity? As far as we're concerned, accountability in the decision-making process and the equitable outcomes for children is what is most important in this process. We are willing to support the governing structure that most efficiently, equitably, and with greatest deference to the well-being of our children and the relationships with their parents achieves the goals and mission of the Boston Public Schools. In addition, historically, enfranchisement has never rested on someone's ability to pass a test or someone's ability to pay a tax or of their demonstration of their ability to make a good choice or how ruly the field of candidates might be or how contentious the decision would be. The expected outcome of voter participation. As a matter of fact, these were often the pretexts to ensure disenfranchisement of marginalized people. The parade of horribles offered tonight could possibly be dealt with by being careful in the legislation and the ways in which we move forward. As always, the Boston branch of the NAACP stands by its mission to make sure that equity, for all children is achieved, especially along the contours of race and economic status. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jose. Ruby.
Thank you for hosting this hearing. My name is Ruby Reyes. I'm the director of the Boston Education Justice Alliance, a coalition of parents, students, and teachers working to support public education in Boston. Every single city and town in our state has a school committee elected by the residents who live there, so why not Boston? And along the same lines, I'd like to offer a vignette that happened last week. On Wednesday, December 5th, I was at the Bowling Building until midnight. I was listening to the back and forth of school committee members talk about the difficulty of making the decision to close West Roxbury Educational Complex. They have to decide the fate of 690 students on December 19th. They asked BPS administration questions, wanting more information, data, and options. Currently, our appointed school committee is made up of 7 voting members: Dr. Miren Uriarte, who just stepped down from her post, Alex Oliver Davila, Dr. Harding Coleman, Regina Robinson, Jerry Robinson, Michael Aconso, and Michael O'Neill. Evelyn Reyes is the Boston Student Advisory Council representative, but she has no voting privilege. In its essence, these 7, now 6 people, are given the task of shutting down a school and dispersing students to wherever there is space. The 7 members have pushed, brainstormed, and tried to make sense of the mess in order to make the best decision. They have shared how they have stayed awake thinking about what they should do. They have listened to parents, students, teachers, and so many community voices unanimously and resoundingly demand not to harm our children, our public education, and for school communities to stay together. The school committee has asked hard questions, spoken up, and on behalf of our students. School committee members referenced the Parthenon report, commissioned by BPS, which showed research that 91% of students who entered school in 9th grade and stayed for their entire high school career graduated in 4 years. However, just 35% of students who eventually transferred to another high school graduated in 4 years. School committee members emphatically understand that they will be directly responsible for the dropout of over 287 students with this one decision. And that does not include the generations of young people who will follow their parents' lead in dropping out. However, on December 19th, they will vote, most likely to close West Roxbury, and disperse students wherever BPS says they have first choice, when their first choice is to remain together. Why? Because they almost always vote to unanimously pass whatever is put before them. That, in essence, is what is flawed about an appointed school committee. You have a group of 7 longtime residents, professionals, people dedicated to education trying to do what's best for Boston's children, teachers, and parents, but consistently vote what they have been appointed to vote. We know that Mayor Walsh ultimately selects school committee members. We know that, like the appointment of interim superintendent Laura Perrell and the choice of Tommy Chang, the mayor pushes in a particular direction and the school committee responds accordingly. Boston is a city with tight mayoral control, and that is centered on one person. It is heart-wrenching because it's not democratic. Boston serves the largest number of students of color across Massachusetts, and it is the only appointed school committee. While BPS is the largest slice of the city's financial pie, and many voters certainly care about education, the fact is that the mayor's commitment to public education is only a piece of his campaign, one piece of his administration's priorities, and one piece of why people did or did not vote for him. Our current system does not allow for those generations of Bostonians most directly impacted by BPS to vote. The young people whose fate is being decided through this appointed group have no say-so in what happens to them. The representative has no voting power. All our communities can do is provide testimony, meet with elected officials who have no direct say over the schools, hope that an undemocratically selected committee listens to those who should be its real constituents, and hope that a decision by an appointed group represents their best interests. An elected school committee creates space for a democratic process to hold accountability for people responsible for the best part of our city, our children. The fear of an elected school committee is rooted in a very present history of race in Boston, but the demographics and voting patterns of Boston have changed since the start of the appointed committee. The election of 6 women of color to the city council, including 3 elected citywide, as well as Ayanna Pressley's election to Congress, shows that at least when it comes to voting, Boston is outgrowing its past history of race riots and segregation. However, Our neighborhoods continue to be divided by race and class. According to the Boston Planning and Development Agency in 2015, the median family income in Roxbury was $26K, while the median family income in the newly invested and developing Seaport area was $111K. The ghastly statistics from the 2015 Color of Wealth report by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston only highlighted the disturbing racial implications, with Black Bostonians have a median net worth of $8, in comparison to the median net worth of white Bostonians at $247,500. So we know that race is a factor in how the city is divided. I raise this point because community, parent, and civil rights groups who most represent these communities are in favor of an elected school committee. It is the corporate elite who most benefit from the harsh inequity in Boston that, according to today's Boston Globe, most supports an unelected, undemocratic school committee. We propose an elected school committee have a structure similar to that of the City Council, in which there are several citywide seats as well as a neighborhood specific. In addition, we support adding much-needed voting youth representatives. The Boston Education Justice Alliance believes in democracy and concludes that it makes sense at this time for Boston to return to a fully elected school committee to direct our city's most important duty, the care and education of our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. Welcome, Edith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening, and honorable city councilors. My name is Edith Bazil, and I am a graduate of the Boston Public Schools. I also served 14 years as a teacher and 18 years as a district-wide administrator. I'm here to present as president of Boston Educators Alliance of Massachusetts, our statement, and I thank you for this opportunity to share Beam's position on this very important issue. We believe that the governance of Boston Public Schools is broken. The mayoral-appointed Boston School Committee has failed to deliver equitable quality education to all Boston students. It is time to restore an elected school committee to Boston, as in every other city and town in Massachusetts. I'm sure we can all agree that the most important charge for any school committee, as has been stated, is to ensure that the schools they govern provide quality education for all students. However, despite the promises of an appointed school committee that education would improve for all students in Boston, BPS remains among the lowest ranks of school districts in Massachusetts. According to the latest state accountability data, BPS has 49 schools in need of either focused or broad support from the state. Opportunity and achievement gaps persist for students of color, students who are English learners, and students with disabilities. Unlike school committees in every other town in Massachusetts, the Boston School Committee takes its direction from the mayor, not from the parents or other citizens. The mayor appoints school committee members, and they respond primarily to the mayor. On major issues that drive quality of education, such as budget and facilities, the mayor makes the decisions, and the school committee dutifully follows them, despite the expressed wishes of parents, students, other citizens, and often the school committee members themselves. We know that recently parents, students, BPS staff, by the hundreds, have protested to the school committee over budget cuts to schools, school closures, and other issues, as my colleagues have stated. The school committee has listened to these protests in hearings and forums, but has largely ignored them, as they have voted the mayor's wishes. The Boston School Committee can disregard the voices of Boston citizens because it is directly accountable to the mayor and not the voters. Again, unlike school committees in every other city and town in Massachusetts, Boston citizens no longer elect members of the school committee. Voters in Boston cannot directly elect to their school committee people who represent their educational priorities and concerns. Voters also cannot remove school committee members who take actions contrary to the interests of the voters. Why should Boston, a large urban city with a majority population of people of color, be the only city totally disenfranchised from this democratic process. Since 1991, Boston has had school committees appointed by mayors of the city. Nearly 3 decades is sufficient time for the appointed school committees to have demonstrated that they could deliver quality education to all Boston residents. They have not. It is time to restore to Boston citizens the right enjoyed by citizens of all other Massachusetts cities and towns. If Boston citizens are competent to elect a mayor, a city council, and a host of other state and federal officials, surely they are competent to elect members of the school committee. In closing, we reiterate that the data shows that the appointed school committee has failed to demonstrate improvement in the educational outcomes for all BPS students and has disenfranchised parents over and over again for the past 30 years, nearly 30 years. In order to save the current and future generations of Boston public school students from being condemned to mediocre educational outcomes that ill prepares them for the professions of the future, and to give BPS students, parents, and citizens, including those who serve as teachers, administrators, and staff in this great city of Boston, an authentic voice in the decision-making process. The time is now for an elected school committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Edith. Mary.
Good evening. My name is Mary Battenfeld. I've been a Boston public school parent since 2000 when my oldest entered Young Achievers as a K-1 student. And I'm a member of the grassroots parent group Quest, Quality Education for Every Student, and a resident of Jamaica Plain, and proud to be represented by Councilor O'Malley. Thank you for holding this hearing and for your advocacy on behalf of Boston Public Schools. We're here because we currently don't have a chance to elect our school committee. But you, as our city councilors, have frequently raised your voices to advocate for our students and families. I and other parents deeply appreciate the listening tours, the meetings with Quest and other parent, student, and community groups, and I particularly want to thank Councilor Edwards for coming out on a cold, rainy night the Monday after Thanksgiving to Curtis Hall to meet with Quest when we held a meeting about Build BPS. I also appreciate the public statements such as the one read at last week's school committee on the Build BPS plan. But that indirect influence, important as it is as a mitigating factor, does not change the fact that an entirely appointed school committee disenfranchises parents and gives too much power to the mayor. City Hall and BPS make decisions without any prior notice, much less community engagement. 3 recent examples of this are the forced departure of Dr. Chang, the attempt to institute a unified charter district enrollment lottery, and the lack of oversight of the home-based student assignment system with the problems highlighted by Mr. Lopez. As a result, parents are blindsided and come to distrust the district. Family engagement comes to mean PR messaging to get parents on board with an already determined plan rather than a genuine shared decision-making process. Thus, an appointed school committee has a demonstrably negative impact on family and community engagement. It's at odds with democracy, and given that 86% of Boston Public School students are Black, Asian, or Latino, it is at odds with racial equity. It fundamentally clashes with the tenet expressed by your colleague and Congresswoman-elect Ayanna Pressley that, quote, the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power driving and informing our policymaking. For a long time, I have been on the fence, and Quest itself had not taken a position on the BPS governance structure. However, after so many years of seeing the people closest to the pain shut out of any decisions affecting our children, of watching helplessly as Boston School Committee makes choices that go against the clearly expressed wishes and best interests of family and students, that's gotten me off the fence. I'm firmly in favor of Boston joining the 98 to 99% of the rest of the country and allowing our community to elect the people who take care of our schools and through them our children. The voices of people closest to the pain, not business or political leaders who sit above it, should elect our city's school leaders. Most recently, as you have heard, the voices closest to the pain have been the parents, teachers, and students of the McCormick Middle School and West Roxbury Education Complex. Listening to them, speaking in Spanish or Haitian Creole, or in the halting, eloquent tones of a student on the autism spectrum, I am struck both by the power of those testimonies and by our powerlessness. We lack the power to do what State Representative Charles Ianello did back in 1953, not to be confused with Chris Ianello, after who this chamber is named. In 1951, then Superintendent Isidore Munchik proposed closing 20 schools as a cost-saving measure. Representative Ianello, along with parents, students, and alums from affected schools such as Boston Clerical, Dorchester High School for Girls, and the Oliver Wendell Homes, petitioned the school committee. These community voices vowed, as the Boston Globe put it, to, quote, work for the defeat in this fall's election of school committee members who favor the school closings. Not only do we lack any real mechanism to hold City Hall and BPS accountable for critical decisions such as school closings, but school committee members themselves may be hobbled from doing what they think is right. The appointed system makes them and the nonprofit or other organizations they often represent dependent upon the mayor. Politics remains very much at play, but it's politics in the negative sense of influence and patriotism and patronage, as opposed to the positive potential of electoral politics, a potential seen in so many local and national races this fall. I am so proud that that former elected school committee member and MECO director Jean McGuire is here, and I asked her permission. I actually have a quote from her in here. She said this in 1996 during the referendum battle over the elected school committee. It really concerns me that we would give up in Boston what we dumped tea in Boston Harbor for. And then she added, and this was referring to the Bill Clinton campaign slogan, "It's democracy, stupid." I was asked to speak here as a parent and a member of Quest, but I'm also a history professor for many years at Wheelock College and now at Boston University. And at some point, I would be happy to speak about the 19th century history that Councilor DeCara gave, because I have a different take on it. But before writing these comments, I do what I always do in seeking to understand an issue. I listen to parents and community members, and I research the history. The dominant narrative of a dysfunctional school committee in the 70s and 80s is not entirely false, but nor is it the whole story. Particularly, it's important to acknowledge that Black elected officials in communities of color largely opposed an appointed school committee. In 1989, the City Council voted 10-2 for an appointed board. The two no votes were the two African-American councilors, Charles Yancey and Bruce Bowling, after whom, ironically, in the context of that vote, the school committee headquarters are named. Hattie McGinnis, a Black parent leader and at that time head of the citywide parent council, also advocated voting against an appointed board because, quote, it gives complete control to the mayor for whatever he wants to do. And the state legislature, many Black and Hispanic representatives voted against the petition for an appointed board. Mr. Tyler spoke about the election results, and so often with aggregate figures, you miss what's really happening at a more deep level. In fact, a study of the city referendums in both 1991 and 1996 would show you that race was the strongest predictor of support for an elected school committee, with voters in predominantly Black wards far more likely to favor an elected committee. I think, don't quote me on this because I didn't come thinking of this, but I think it was 64% of the dominantly Black wards in 1991 voted to keep an elected board, and it was 57% in 1996. There were also East Boston, Charlestown, also were communities that had higher percentages voting to keep an elected board. So that narrative that, oh, the city overwhelmingly voted for it just isn't false. It doesn't capture it. Democracy is messy. As the 2016 reminds us, a lot can go wrong. But that doesn't mean we should do wrong in return. Disenfranchising some of Boston's most marginalized citizens, disenfranchising parents from voting on representatives for people who will control the schools their children attend, disenfranchising people, disallowing us from having a say in who determines the policies for our schools and our children's lives is wrong. I thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to further conversations about how we can make it right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to all of you for your testimony this evening. I'm going to open it up for questions from my colleagues. Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen. I really appreciate that thoughtful and, in my opinion, right on the mark testimony that you all gave. And Professor Badenfeld, particularly appreciate your closing arguments about why politics in the school committee, we ought to be talking about it as a good thing, because yes, democracy is messy, but it also allows for that direct representation. And if we were to suggest that there's no politics in the current structure, we're not being honest with ourselves. So to open that process up to more is something that I firmly believe we ought to be exploring and moving to. So I guess my question is, and anyone can jump in, or if everyone wants to just weigh in, I sort of heard loudly and clearly a lot of support from this panel on having a similar structure to, I think, the 1983 version, which would essentially be 4 at-large, citywide elected school committee members and then 9 districts, analogous with the council districts. Any thought on sort of what I've been talking about with this hybrid approach, which other cities have done? I know Washington, D.C. did it. They may have changed back, but having some elected and some appointed. Does anyone sort of want to weigh in on thoughts on that?
So, Councilor O'Malley, I actually want to be very clear as it relates to the NAACP Boston branch position at this point in time. We have not formally come out in support of any particular governance structure, but where we are firmly positioned is in a belief that when it comes to the relinquishment of the right to vote for school committee representation in the city of Boston, that it is high time for us to revisit that decision. Anytime we either relinquish voluntarily or we are stripped of our right to vote in this country, it should only be in extreme circumstances when there is no other alternative. And so while there may have been conditions in 1989 and 1996 that led this city to believe that we had no other alternative but to go forward with an appointed school committee, our position is that the time is now for us to have an open, transparent conversation as a city about what is the best governance structure for our school committee that will lead to the academic outcomes that we all want to see for our children. And so while the conversation is starting here and we appreciate it, or continuing here and we appreciate it, it's our position that we need to, as a city, over the next couple of months, really engage in deep conversation and examination of the conditions that led to the decision to move toward an appointed school committee. Specifically, what we believe we need to have a better understanding of is whether an appointed school committee has actually done the job it was set out that we believed it was going to do. One of the comments that was made on the earlier panel was with respect, and you commented on it as well, was that a comment with respect to the many issues that this school district is facing, whether we're talking about the elimination of achievement and opportunity gaps, we're talking about decisions related to facilities, we're talking about funding for the district, we're talking about who's sitting in our classrooms for children. When we get to the root of all of those issues, where we end up is with the school committee. The school committee is the body that makes the decisions related to all of those issues. And so, again, our position at this point in time is that we need to have a conversation, not about kind of whether we should continue to have an appointed school committee or not, but really about how do we get us back to an elected school committee that enables the people and the families in the city of Boston to be empowered once again when it comes to decisions that are made in this district.
Thank you, Madam President. Appreciate sort of that context. Did anyone else want to weigh in on sort of a hybrid model or thoughts, pros,
I want
cons?
to echo
Please.
what Tanisha said. However, we believe that in order to have true input and an inclusive and transparent process, and also engender trust in parents, that there must be a balance of power and voice in the decision-making process. Right now, BPS continues to struggle with family and community engagement. That's always been an issue. And one of the things is building trust and parents being involved in having the power of their voices heard and being part of the decisions that are being made and not being made shrouded in secrecy. Many of the decisions that have been made, and we could include the assignment of the appointment of the interim superintendent, the Bill BPS issue, and a number of issues have been made, and parents feel that even though forums and meetings are held, that's just a check in the box, that their voices are not heard, that their input is not included, that they are not part of the decision-making process. So from the position of Black Educators Alliance of Massachusetts, we strongly believe that we need to go back to an elected school committee so that we can have clear representation and parents have a voice. They have an opportunity to speak to representatives who have their priorities and interests in mind, and they can connect and speak with them in an open and transparent way. So we definitely are for an elected school committee.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add that I think in its essence, the mayoral control is the real situation that hinders the democratic process. And so with a hybrid model, you still have mayoral control in appointments and in decisions. Currently with the West Roxbury Complex decision that's going to be happening next week on December 19th, I hope you all are able to make it and support those children and families that are fighting so hard to keep their school open and keep their education. The school committee has asked really hard questions to BPS, and they've made comments about how some of the information that they've given them doesn't feel right, and how they've been in, they're educational professionals, and and the numbers don't add up. So they themselves have distrust of BPS, and so, but again, they're making decisions that they're appointed to, and so I think the real crux of the situation is the lack of democracy in elected members representing these communities. And Councilor Matt O'Malley is, West Roxbury Academy and Urban Science Academy are in your district. I hope that you'll be supportive of those families looking to remain together.
I have been met early on with the students, and will continue to do everything I can. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Thank you very much, Madam Chair. No, I'm good.
Great, thank you, Councilor O'Malley. Councilor Edwards.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I really think the historical context and getting into the details about the history, the racialized history, which was used to justify an appointed school committee, it really helps to understand that in reality there are many, many, many levels to this conversation, and that the fact that some of the ardent supporters of an elected school committee have been African Americans throughout the entire discourse is extremely important. I really appreciate and want to thank you for highlighting that. I think there's a couple things, though, that you touched on, and anyone can answer these questions as they come up, as I present them, but inasmuch as democracy, the business of democracy is messy, right? And as much as money is very, very still, unfortunately, part of our political discourse, one of the biggest concerns I have, and why I kind of look at the hybrid model where there's at least some permanent standing members, or a model where you have a staggered election system where not all of the members are up for election like we do in Congress. Only some are up, and then some are up, and then some are up, so that you always have kind of a person there. Not everyone's running at the same time, for example, and also trying to run the schools. So some of the issues I'm really concerned about is how do you account for, with democracy and money and charter schools or entities and professionals coming in and being able to influence by an election, put out literature, be able to promote the person's name. You know, money does make a difference. It doesn't make the difference, as we've seen in recent elections. There have been people who have been way outraised, I myself was, and still be able to win. But man, does it change things, how money can influence. So tell me, in your model for an elected school committee, how do you envision money influencing, you know, being a part of this?
I think it's part of the electoral process. I mean, I feel like there's a political system that we deal with currently where, you know, when you're raising funds for political campaigns, you're taking money from charter investors as well as non-charter investors. So I think that it happens across the board, right? And so in its essence, that's part of what makes the process messy, but it's also, it affects your positions, right? And so, you know, those things are, I think, part of the political process. If you want to talk about the possibilities of putting in structures where only a certain amount can be used for political campaigns, that's a worthy conversation across the board, not just for an elected school committee, but, you know, maximizing a certain amount for campaigns. I would love to see that not just in an elected school committee, but for city council positions, for, you know, legislators, for mayors, you know, that cap. You can only spend so much. And, you know, and there's always ugly ways around it. And there are we've seen huge corporate investments in charters. We've seen huge, I mean, most recently in today's Boston Globe, you know, there was actually Paul Grogan from the Boston Foundation wrote an editorial to the Boston Globe and then was quoted in today's Boston Globe around the possibility of increasing the number of charters. And while on most things, public education-wise, I don't agree with Paul Grogan, he did say that there was mayoral control in his editorial. So I think, you know, in democracy, that is part of what makes it ugly. You had a panel up here earlier with a non-Boston resident giving you information about the historical context. And, you know, I'm a Boston resident, I'm a Dorchester resident, I'm a homeowner. I'm not a BPS parent, but I've worked with so many children in the city. And that's my dedication to public education, is that it has to work.
With Ruby, I mean, the money is going to be a factor, but what I appreciate most about the question is the question, because I think it's the right path, right, in terms of, again, I think the focus for this body and for us as a city is about trying to figure out what structures do we need to put in place to have the best system that's most representative of the people and the will of the people. And so whether we talk about, you know, is it 13 people or 7 people, is it hybrid or is it fully elected, to me, you know, the devil's in the details, so to speak. But I think if we all fundamentally believe, and this is the theme that you heard consistently up here, if we all fundamentally believe in democracy, like really believe in it, really believe that the people in this city have the right to choose who represents us when it comes to governance, then we can be as disruptive and as creative as we want to be when it comes to kind of how we structure this thing. But I think what's troubling to me most is that in 2018, somehow democracy is like this radical idea, right? Like we're fighting for our right to vote, for our representation. And to me, that's crazy and deeply disheartening. And so again, I appreciate the question because it's the right path. And so I'm hopeful that again, we can, whether it's pulling together yet another commission, to figure out how do we do this? How do we move forward in a way that's not divisive? Because the last thing we need is another divisive issue in the city that pulls us further apart. But how do we come together to figure out how we are going to, as Professor Battenfeld said, restore power to the people? How do we do that? So again, I appreciate the question.
To have trust in the public to make these decisions because they haven't had the opportunity. What we do right now know is that there's a lack of equity. We know that our neighborhoods in our schools in Dorchester, parts of Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapian are disproportionately affected by decisions that are made. And there's no representation. So we're going from ground zero to something. And to put the power back into the hands of the people and to give them voice is going to include those neighborhoods who have, for the past 30 years, been disenfranchised and have not had decisions that have been in their best interest. And as a result, we have this fueling achievement gap, opportunity gap among these populations of students. And the parents don't feel that they have a voice and input to change it. So we have to have trust in the public that their voices will be heard, and this is a process where everyone will have an opportunity to be part of the decision making.
I also just want to add one other thing because I think it bears underscoring. Race was absolutely a factor in kind of our decision as a city to move to an appointed school committee, but class was as well. Class was very much so at play. And so in the other actually area of this neighborhood in the city, Professor Battenfeld, that voted in opposition to an appointed school committee initially was South Boston. So South Boston, Charlestown, Eastie, and wards in Roxbury. So this was as much about class as it was about race. And when we look at some of the decisions that are being made and it's not just the current school committee, by the school committee over the past 15 to 20 years, not only are we seeing an underlying theme of racial inequity, but we're also seeing class disenfranchisement. And so again, rethinking how we are governing our schools will not only help with respect to racial equity, but also in helping to close the class divide.
The only other thing I'd add is that money in campaigns maybe have gotten worse with dark money and things, but it has always been an issue. In fact, in the 1996 referendum, I think those in favor of an elected committee spent about $5,000. Those to keep the appointed was about $600,000. So they were hugely outspent. And question 2 actually made me feel better about this, about the money that particularly in Boston is a smaller city than LA, door knocking, low cost kind of campaigning really can work.
No, and I think it's a testament to some of us sitting here on the city council that yes, and I can't remember who testified to it, that with Congresswoman-elect's election, with the new demographics of the city council, the voters in Boston are demonstrating a willingness to consider, to look at, and to move in a different way. And I think it's worth capturing that energy in looking at, again, how we govern our schools. I would encourage, because I think this conversation is just the beginning and will only get more intense in a good way, that as advocates, I would really love for you to, when you come back in your testimony, I've read it, it's incredible, but when you come back and talk about the things we need to consider about messy democracy and how in the creative, amazing mind space that we have, how we can account for that and protect democracy and assure the people's will. I would love for you to look at things such as how we're doing redistricting, how that could look like for a school committee, redistricting or drawing district lines. Term limits are something that is worth, I don't know, in your analysis, if it does make us more democratic or not. What makes someone qualified to run for school committee? Should it be, as someone eloquently quoted my colleague, closest to the pain, should be closest to the power, so should only BPS parents be running for school committee with children currently in the system, so that their direct decisions are going to directly impact not just tens of thousands of children, but their own. Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe they would be too biased toward the schools that their kids go to. I don't know. Looking at Boston residency as a requirement, yes or no, it's up to you. Looking at who can vote for school committee. We've had an analysis about voting, expanding voting rights. I do know that I think it's worth considering children, young adults, I would say. They may not like the children. Whether seniors in high school who can pre-register to vote at 16 should be able to vote and be part of this process. The step-up analysis that I think Mr. DeCara brought up, that people would only use this as a stepping stone to get into politics, I would argue that people could use this as a stepping stone to get into politics. So, I mean, that as a lot of women have done this, a lot of women of color have done this. So, is that always a bad thing that this is a training ground for some of the most actively involved individuals? I'll say this, there's still a gender equity issue. And so I'll just put that out there. And then finally, participatory budgeting and how maybe that could be a counter to that. So direct, whether we have this elected school committee or not, but whether there should be a direct vote on the budget by folks or components of the school budget by Bostonians. And then finally, I mean, I've certainly wondered, would it make more sense if you were to weigh the elected school committee versus an outright just election for superintendent? Just those analysis. And I ask this only because I have more questions than answers. And I really, really appreciate your testimony. I'm going to throw it right back at you, Jose. You killed it in your analysis and the way you broke down, especially that how voting for a mayor cannot be the way in which we hold school committee members accountable. It just cannot be, by virtue of how many years it takes to vote for a mayor, but also by virtue of how many kids do not go to BPS and whose parents still vote for the mayor. I don't have children, for example. I mean, I do care about, obviously, in my position, BPS and students in schools, but I can assure you, when I was much younger and here in Boston, that was not at the top of my mind when I was voting for the mayor. So I think I would love to have that deeper analysis as you guys go back to your expertise and to your bases and to your individuals, and to add in, how do we make democracy less messy when we're going to be talking about opening it up for school committee. But thank you so much for being here tonight.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Thank you all again. I do have one question, because time is a significant barrier to changing the governance structure of the school committee. It will take a very long time to get to that point. When we think about charter reform, we think about the process that we need to follow. I think the needs of our parents, I think about myself as a BPS parent, changes that need to happen, and the changes that many parents are calling for, especially those that are testifying on a regular basis before school committee, are looking for a much more immediate change. So like I posed to Sam and Larry earlier, what are some of the opportunities that you might see as ways to improve the current structure, the current body as it sits right now as an appointed body? We'll start, Tanisha, we'll start over there again.
I think there are a couple of things. I mean, one, the citizens nominating panel. I think that's certainly over the past probably 6 weeks or so, I have become increasingly more concerned about that particular panel. As someone who probably follows education in the city of Boston more than most, I struggled to even name 5 members of that nominating panel, and that's disturbing, especially given how much responsibility they have for identifying currently nominees for the committee. So I do think looking at the structure of that particular panel, also, again, as we kind of currently sit here, being more transparent in that process, making sure that that families and residents of the city of Boston know when they're meeting, and know what is open to the public and what is not, I think would be something that could be done now. I do think, look, the responsibility of the school committee is to certainly hire, evaluate, terminate when appropriate the superintendent, and to set the policy of the district. It's the responsibility of the mayor to appoint the school committee members. And then the mayor is supposed to step out. And so one of the other things that could be done immediately that could change is for the school committee to do its job. And that is to act as an independent body. And to make decisions that they believe are in the best interest of our children, families, and educators. And as was mentioned on this panel, time and time again, what we hear in testimony from school committee members, time after time, is how painful the decisions are that they're making, how much they don't agree with the decisions that they're going to make, and yet they cast votes contrary to their interests and to their beliefs all the time. So, again, one thing that could change tomorrow is for the school committee to do its job.
Thank you.
I wanted to add that currently there's a structure where there's a BSAC representative of young people on the school committee. They have been asking to have that person be a voting member. That's one easy way that already has a selected person representing young people. Currently, there's also a superintendent search that many of us contributed to a statement where we asked for an educational leader, and we want that to be the focus of the search, someone who's a visionary, someone who believes in public education, a champion of public education. We don't want a manager. We don't want a fiscal manager. We don't want someone who is digitally literate. We want an educational powerhouse. And then I think the other two issues are housing and gentrification. And this is more along the lines of the City Council's work as well, is just thinking about the overdevelopment in the city and how many families are being pushed out because of rental costs and the inability to pay for those skyrocketing rental costs because of the overdevelopment in the city. And then budgeting at the City Council level as well. We haven't even gotten into school budget season where, every school committee since the announcing of the school closings has been pretty full. The school committee has been staying there till midnight because they've been listening to all these families talk about the impact of these school closings. And then that'll happen with the second wave of the budget cuts that they'll be announcing. And I know that you all vote on a budget that isn't necessarily line item based, but really thinking about your budgetary votes and your stances and your priorities in the budgeting season as it quickly approaches.
Well, we believe that based upon the most recent plan to close schools, there's not a real plan for what's going to happen to those students. And at the last school committee meeting on September 5th, it was not clearly delineated. For example, there are 60 students in the autism program over at West Roxbury Educational Complex. And there's no real plan in terms of what is going to happen with them. We believe that the school committee needs to have a moratorium on the school closings until they have a clear plan of what is going to happen with those students that is clearly laid out to the parents. We also believe that the input from the community is not being listened to by the school committee. For example, they voted on a job description that does not have the 3 top priorities that the community provided. And they continue to have listening sessions, and they're not folding in the recommendations of the community. So we believe that, yes, the school committee members need to do their job. They need to listen to the community, and they need to take the input and clearly listen to it and integrate that input and provide the parents with some real answers. But more than that, they need to have a dialogue about what's happening in the schools because parents are not clear and there's not a clearly laid out plan in terms of what are the next steps on the heels of school closures, the superintendent search the job description. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done with these hot button issues that are clearly disrupting a lot of the lives of the parents right now.
Thank you, Edith. Mary.
The only thing I would add is a specific suggestion to do for them to do what you have done. In other words, have us come up here and speak as an official panel instead of Ruby and I. Literally, it was after midnight when we testified on Wednesday night, and then you don't get any feedback, give and take. You read your statement, they cut you off, you're gone.
I will appreciate that because I have that same experience when I testify before school committee.
Yes, but to have to let community and parent members to count us as partners and not just have BPS officials up there all the time.
So clearly, you are a model for what we'd like to see happen in the school committee, and we thank you for the reciprocity.
If I may, Counselor. I'm not sure what we could ask the school committee to do now. And that's because it's such a strict body. And to try to transform that right now would be very difficult. I do think, in thinking about how to change that, I mean, I don't know what we could do now that would change the fact that with the current configuration, we've had 2 Department of Justice investigations into BPS with serious findings about our noncompliance with providing children with their federally mandated minutes regarding ESL instruction, to then only have the Department of Justice return and find that there was noncompliance in that. I don't know what right now we could do to make the school committee more accountable to that, right? Or the fact that before our last mayoral election, one of our children in East Boston was pulled out of school and set for deportation for an argument in a school cafeteria. And I didn't expect for a city to decide that that was just the mayor's fault and hold him accountable for that. But nevertheless, there was really no one held accountable for that, right? That policy decision, a decision that came from a policy deciding to share, right, information with federal agents about, incidents that might happen in school. So I don't know what right now the current structure would really allow for. However, if I could make a recommendation about the city council and maybe how the city council could be more helpful in this endeavor as we try to get to a more equitable education for our children. I think one would be more auditing on the budget sort of after the fiscal year has come to an end, to look for how monies were spent and how effective or efficient, right, those endeavors were to furthering the education of children. I also think there's a missed opportunity for proactively deciding how we would like as a city our community-based credits to be spent by our nonprofit partners around the city who get tens of millions of dollars in CBCs and are allowed to spend those without any direction, I think, really from citizens on how they should be spent. So I think that might be an interesting way to say, could we do more with what we're getting? If we're going to allow a college to claim $3 million of community-based credits, then maybe, we want $1 million of that to go to after-school tutoring, right? Or whatever it is, kind of set those guidelines. I think the courage, quite frankly, that you're exhibiting now and this body's exhibiting now and engaging in this dialogue, I mean, that's all we need to get this conversation started and to continue doing what we're doing here today and to have these wonderful people continue to show up and lend their expertise to you. I've gone to some of the best colleges, universities this state can offer, and I learn more on my way out of meetings than I do from sitting in those courses because we benefit from such deep expertise. And so I would share with you, and I would share with you, Counselor, that you have all of the expertise that you need to make some great informed decisions on this. And until a change, you can continue to count on us to hold people as accountable as we can, right, to these things, and that includes the current structure and members of the school committee, who I want to make sure we don't demonize.
Thank you.
Okay? because they've been appointed. And I do believe, because I've seen them go from meeting to meeting and be exhausted and be tired and listen. And I know that that's taxing on the body emotionally, physically. So I know that they're trying to do what they can. This might be an opportunity to liberate them from some of the stress and pressure that they might be under. But at a minimum, I do want to make sure that for those members who do show up from the heart and do the work from the heart, that we also let them know that we see them, and we're also here to support them as well.
I'm going to take that quote.
I don't know which one, but let it be a good one.
And I think we do have still a few more folks for public testimony, but I do appreciate you saying that about the school committee members. This is not a judgment about them as individuals. I know all of them to varying degrees, and individually they are very good people that are sort of functioning under the constraints of the structure of that school committee. I also will say at this point, some of you referenced my earlier panel. They were both invited guests of mine. Residency is a really important thing to me personally, something that I work on both as a member of the Residency Commission, but also when we talk about our students in the Boston Public Schools being residents of the city of Boston. So I do want to say for the record, as an invited guest of my panel, it's not about where an individual lives when they're an invited guest on the panel. It's about the information that they're able to share. So I want to make that clear. Any additional questions? Thank you. So you all are welcome to certainly stay. I do have a few more members of the audience that want to give public testimony, which I'd like to get to that. So while you're clearing out, thank you very much. And we will not be here as late as school committee is often. I joke that I can go from school committee meetings and testifying early on, which I have the great liberty to do, then going to another community meeting or event, and then going home and watch the end of the meeting while folding laundry. So I know Dr. Jean McGuire is with us, who would like to testify. And that's all I have left for signing up for public testimony. If anyone would like to testify following Dr. McGuire, you're welcome to line up behind her. There it is. Thank you. If you would introduce yourself for the record and share your testimony.
Jean McGuire, live in Roxbury, 35 Denison Street. Is that enough?
That's enough. Thank you for being here.
Okay. I just hope that all of us have the sense and the humility to trust that as citizens know what's best for their students. It seems that in much of the discourse, people discount the fact that the citizens of Boston whose children attend the schools, whether they're legal citizens, the residents, let me clarify that, the residents of Boston, who attend, who support, and who, as I am concerned, always should have the voice of the vote. I do not understand anywhere in the country, even where they've had appointed school committees, there's usually a different structure. Most of New England and most of the East Coast, to my knowledge, all have elected school committees. In the years I've dealt with Metropolitan Boston, I have never seen an appointed school committee. I voted against it when I was on the 5-member elected school committee, and then the one that added and made it at large, both on the city council and on the school committee. We have a right under the Constitution, when in the course of human events, we the people, forget all those categories, we the people who live here on this continent, this sweet country with 2 oceans and many seas, and deserts and mountains and prairies and cities and small hamlets. We, the people, have and should always have and never give up the right to our voice and the vote. Upon this, the United States is based. I cannot for the life of me understand how we can have a serious constitutional crisis pending when we talk about giving up the right to our voice. The four freedoms, the freedom of speech, the freedom of voice, the freedom of the vote, the freedom to live where we want. Watch these restrictions. They are dangerous, very dangerous. And there's only one child in the world, and that child is all children. Doesn't matter their color, their size, their gender. They have to have an education to the best of our ability. And this country spent on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq $1.6 trillion. A lot of that is our tax money. And we should keep that in mind, because one of the reasons we want to educate people is to help them to be prepared to defend and maintain democratic structures in the world. If other countries aren't democratic, we are in trouble. We're not on an island by ourselves. We have to work with, compete with, exchange goods and services with countries and nations all over the world. And we're beginning to have all these restrictions and devices and words that I never remember hearing. And I noticed when they first started closing schools, the Black Educators Alliance, which was then the Massachusetts Negro Educators Alliance, and members of the BTU, we found that the 33 first schools that were closed in Roxbury. So our kids had to get onto the bus. Now, many of us on the last elected 5-member school committee at large, which was how I got elected, are still around. I talked to Dan Burke, who was adamantly opposed to school transportation for any reasons, until what was Roxbury, what was Girls Latin School, where Mass College of Art is now, was changed, I think, to Dorchester, to Codman Square. And the children from South Boston were told they had to get the T to get to school. So we sat there in the school committee, and Dan decided, oh, well, wait a minute. I've got about 20 parents from Southie here who want their kids to have a bus to school, and he had voted against transportation. He later became a principal and a superintendent in Metco Towns and was an adamant supporter of adequate and safe transportation for children to get to school. Not many children live where they go to school. Latin school is not in anybody's neighborhood. I went to Girls Latin on the Fenway. We took the bus, we took the train, we took the trolley from Park Square. The whole idea of the word neighborhood schools never came up when I was in school. It was assumed that the schools were for everybody. So we need to watch about these restrictions and these categories and these layers against which we are categorizing our children and their parents. Parents have good sense. It doesn't matter whether they're a legal citizen or not. If they live here, they pay taxes here because they pay rent. So we need to make certain that the voice of the people is always heard, that the voice always has the right to vote, always. Once you lose the right to vote, once you lose your voice, you lose democracy. And this is a sweet country. It's got 2 oceans. It's got seas, it's got mountains, it has prairies, it has small towns, has big towns, it has people from all over where the 4 winds blow, all over the world. They live here in America. And we can get along together, and we can love and care for our children and give them the very best that will prepare them to be citizens who run the world. Not just the United States, but everyone that we have to communicate with and sell goods to, and often agree to protect them in their wars. I hope that it is clear that I am adamantly for elected officials. Do we want to appoint the governor? Do we want to appoint our state senators? Who's going to do the appointing and upon what terms? Do we want to appoint the city council? I don't think so. I think the people, when they're given clear issues and clear knowledge of what's at stake, they will want to have a voice. And the day we give up the vote, we're not a democracy. I can't, I'm raised in Boston. I went to schools in Boston for most of my life. I went to what was Girls Latin School, the Dearborn. Yes, I love the Dearborn. The David A. Ellis, the Higginson. I went to all, I live around the corner from the Higginson now. And I believe in public education. But in my work, I've also dealt with 131 suburban schools, 31 communities, and their school committees. And I might say, in most elected bodies, nobody goes home until all the business is over. Tell that to your city council from Jean. You don't go home until all the public goes home. That's if you want to get elected again. They want to see that you want to hear their voice. No, I'm serious about that. It means you have to plan. And often, many of us have children and jobs maybe where we have to leave, then you let people know, I can't stay, and reason why. Otherwise, people think you're not interested. So I'm sorry you're the lone person sitting up here, and you're over here. That's true.
And I will say, on behalf of my colleagues, when I schedule a hearing that I'm chairing to fit my schedule.
That's right.
No one else's. So
but that's why when
in defense of my colleagues.
Yeah, but when you run for office, you take that into the count because now you are running to represent the voice of those people where you live. So you have to make a sacrifice. Of all of us who have children and, you know, dinners and washing machines and all that stuff to do and the dogs to let out and
it still
homework.
Waits for you at home. It doesn't get done on its own.
That's right.
Jean, thank you so much.
I respect you, but please, elected at all times, forever. We, the people, went in the course of human events. Those events haven't ended. So I know I speak for the 5 members of the elected school committee that I first joined, and then later the Change School Committee. We were always supportive of the voice of the people. We were always supportive of elected. And when the home rule petition came up again, my student who ran for mayor, Tito, made as a part of his candidacy an elected school committee. The voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you for being with us today.
I want to share with all of you, since I went to Girls Latin School, it's to all of us who are citizens here, and this is from the poet laureate of Turkey. And we used to always at Latin school have to, when we did public speaking, we had to quote from one of our scholars. He was a person who helped to bring Turkey into modern times, but he's one of the world's great poets. His name is Nazim Hikmet. And he has some words which I think all of us in elected office and all of us who vote for people in elected office and all of us who love our children are going to take over for us and pay the bills. Don't live in this world as if you are renting or here only for the summer. Or act as if it's your father's house. Believe in seeds and earth and the sea, but people above all. Love clouds, machines, and books, but people above all. Grieve for the withering branch and the dying star and the hurt animal, but feel for the people above all. Rejoice in all earth's blessings, darkness and light, the 4 seasons, but people above all. For this is one sweet country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think we've got another member for public testimony. Anyone else for public testimony? Great. So, Christine, you get to finish us out this evening.
I'll go fast. Hi, my name is Christine Langhoff. I'm a Dorchester resident. My involvement with the Boston Public Schools stretches back 60 years to 1958, when I started kindergarten at the P.J. Kennedy School in East Boston. I attended school under an elected school committee and also began my career in BPS under an elected school committee. My own 3 kids attended BPS when it was an appointed school committee, and when I retired after 36 years, it was still under the appointed school committee. I'm here today to speak in favor of an elected school committee. One objection many make to an elected board is that it will become political. I would submit that the board is already political. It's just that the politics represented are those of one sole person. In a democracy, the voice of those who pay taxes must be represented. It doesn't work that way currently. Under Mayor Menino, the school committee voted with his priorities 98% of the time. Under Mayor Walsh, we've recently seen one superintendent summarily dismissed and another hired without even the pretext of a school committee vote. Another common objection is that the last elected school committee we had was a disaster. We run the risk in a democracy that sometimes voters will make bad choices, as we can see if we look towards the national stage. But the answer to bad decision-making in a democracy isn't less participation, it's more. Also, the appointed school committee hasn't exactly always inspired confidence. At English High School in December of 2010, again during a round of recommended school closures, one member, name redacted, began to berate a parent in the audience, as reported by the Boston Globe on December 16, 2010. Quote, "When I need a comment from a white privileged kid like you, I'll let you know," end quote from the member. The man who appeared to be in his 20s, the man at whom it was directed, who appeared to be in his 20s and had tattoos on his neck and arms, yelled back that he was unemployed as he voiced his outrage over the comment. A pregnant teacher leaped to the man's defense as she yelled at her seat at the member who was on the stage. That prompted a repeated call for security to remove the pregnant teacher, who ultimately left on her own. Perhaps this member would have been more restrained in his remarks had he known he was going to have to stand for re-election. More recently, there was an October school committee meeting where some 58 individuals gave emotional testimony against the closing of the West Roxbury complex in the McCormick School. While parents, teachers, and students sought to engage the school committee members, one member, seated on the dais, was tweeting about topics totally unrelated to the situation unfolding before him. It is difficult to feel confident that his full attention was directed to those before him, but how might we have held him accountable for his actions? Currently, the composition of Boston School Committee looks more like those of the trustees of Massachusetts charter schools, where some 31% of the trustees come from the corporate world and there is little parent representation. It's worth pointing out that there are no K-12 teachers currently serving on the school committee, as that seems to be considered a conflict of interest rather than pertinent experience. Lastly, Boston is the only one of Massachusetts' 351 cities and towns which lack an elected school committee. We have the largest and the most complex school system in the state, and a wide range of viewpoints is necessary to support our schools. What is the rationale for depriving some 700,000 residents of the representation that all other communities in the state enjoy? Because school committees are cornerstones of democracy, wealthy privatizers have become determined to undermine these school boards across the country. For example, in a keynote speech at the California Charter Schools Association on March 4, 2014, Reed Hastings, who's the CEO of Netflix, advocated for the elimination of school boards. Speaking favorably of charter schools, he said, "The most important thing is that they constantly get better every year. They're getting better because they have stable governance. They don't have an elected school board, and that's a real tough issue. Now, if we go to the general public and we say, here's an argument why you should get rid of school boards, of course, no one's going to go for that. School boards have been an iconic part of America for more than 200 years. I do have one caveat which was raised tonight in the pursuit of an electric school board. We must keep out a wary eye for dark money. In 2017, $15 million was spent on Los Angeles' school board election. And Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, contributed an estimated $7 million. It's an estimate because it's dark money. It's difficult to trace. The goal was to elect a charter-friendly school board, which they did. The board has just named a hedge fund manager and banker, Austin Bootner, a person with no relevant educational experience, to work as superintendent. So there's something we need to keep focused on if we do achieve an elected school board. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Councilor Edwards, do you have any closing remarks? Thank you very much. So I do appreciate everyone, the panels and public testimony today, especially at this hour. I think the input was certainly thoughtful and very informative as we go about this work that's before us. I look forward to working with all of you and certainly a continued conversation about this very specific topic. I think everyone has checked in. If you haven't checked in, please make sure that we have your information so that we can follow up with you regarding next steps. And I look forward to exploring those next steps with you, with my colleagues, and with others who are interested. This meeting is adjourned.